Hey friends, gather close. Tonight, I want to tell you about Henry. You probably would have walked right past her. Most people did. In the grand ecosystem of things, she was just a small gray form, easily lost against the winter grass. But for Henry, who had spent most of his life building sturdy birdhouses and ensuring his own woodpile was neat, that small life changed the orbit of his world. A moment where the giant oak in his yard didn't seem so grand, because something tiny had just survived a fall from its highest branches. If a story like this softens your heart, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely love what we share here at Wild Hearts. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop a comment and tell us the name of an animal that once changed your life. So, pour yourself something warm, find your softest blanket, and let the world go quiet. This is a story worth hearing slowly. Henry was a man who lived his life according to the season. The first frost meant the storm windows went up. The first snowfall meant the extra flannel sheets went on the bed. His routines were quiet, forged by years of living alone on the edge of the sprawling woods, where the nearest neighbor was a mile away, and the most frequent visitors were the deer that raided his small apple orchard. And yet it comes from nowhere else. The old farmhouse was filled with the scents of aged cedar and wood smoke, and Henry was content in that silence. His hands, calloused and mapped with the scars of decades of carpentry, knew the weight of things. The heavy swing of a splitting maul, the delicate placement of a finish nail, the familiar handle of his chipped enamel mug. He understood the wood and the stone, the ways in which things fit together. It was a late afternoon, the air holding the sharp, damp smell of impending snow and decaying leaves, when Henry was following his usual path toward the oversized listing mailbox by the county road. The ancient oak tree, a landmark that had guarded his property for perhaps 200 years, stood sentry at the edge of the driveway. Its branches, stripped bare and blackened by the cold rain, stretched toward the gray sky like an intricately tangled puzzle. Henry knew the squirrels that lived in that tree. He'd watched generations of them, often chuckling at their frantic, acrobatic chases, their dramatic, chattering arguments. They were part of the backdrop, like the wind through the pines, a wind, or the rattle of the old barn door in a gale. Then he heard it. Not a chase, but a sudden, solid, sickening thud against the frost-bitten leaf litter. It was a soft sound, yet heavy in its finality, followed by an immediate, profound silence. He paused, his gaze sweeping the ground at the base of the oak, which was typically just a canvas of dappled shadows. He almost dismissed it, almost logic eddied it away, as a particularly large acorn or a falling branch. But a man who lives in the quiet knows when the quiet is broken with intention. He stepped off the gravels and into the shadow of the great tree, moving toward the sound. There, nestled among the damp brown oak leaves, was a small, bundled shape. A closer look, and his heart gave a small, unfamiliar stutter. It was an eastern gray squirrel. Her dense, grizzled gray coat, shot with silver and a warm cinnamon wash on her tiny flanks, marked her clearly. She was just a juvenile, one that had likely only recently braved the world outside her nest. Her body was motionless, terrifyingly so, her form seemingly too fragile to have survived any impact. Her large, plumed tail, which normally served as a balancing rudder and an expressive flag, was matted to hot, damp debris and hung like a heavy gray rope. For a long minute, Henry stood over her, his hands tucked uselessly into the pockets of his old plaid jacket, the wind whistling softly through the bare branches. The logical, pragmatic part of his mind, the part that dealt with seasons and survival, whispered that this was the way of the wild. Falls happened, small things succumbed. Nature was beautiful, yes, but it was also brutal, and his best course of action was to continue on his path, collect his mail, and return to his warm kitchen. He had lived his life believing there was no room left for small wonders, not after so long, not after the house had grown silent. He wasn't a veterinarian. He was just a carpenter who made things square. And yet, his altered path had begun. He couldn't just walk away. His large, scarred fingers, normally so sure when gripping a hammer, were trembling as he slowly, deliberately knelt beside the small gray shape. His fingers looked comically giant against her size, a clumsy, fumbling tool, attempting an act of impossible delicacy. He gently, so gently, brushed away a damp leaf. He thought she looked less like a fierce wild thing and more like a miniature velvet rag, something that had been lost, palled, and forgotten. He held his breath, watching her closely, and there, against all odds, was the tiny, shallow rise and fall of her chest, a rapid, weak heartbeat trying to keep the flicker alive. In that moment, a quirky detail caught him. Though her body was mostly still, clenching her tiny eyes, shut tight as if trying to shut out the world, one ear kept twitching. One small velvet triangle that kept turning and straining, assessing the giant kneeling above her. She was terrified, yet stubborn. Gently, using both hands as a shallow bowl, he scooped her up. She was surprisingly cold, far too cold for a mammal. Her tiny body felt impossibly light, a creature of air and speed, reduced to a small weight of silence. As he lifted her, his fingertips felt the strange, unnatural angle of one back leg. It was held awkwardly, not curled in defense, but favoring one side, a silent testament to the source of the thud. The brokenness was clear, though he kept the detail soft in his mind. He knew he couldn't leave her here, not with the night closing in and the temperature dropping. He didn't think too deeply about it. He just acted. He tucked his hands, carefully cradling the squirrel, into the front of his jacket, next to his warm flannel shirt. He could feel the tiny heartbeat, a soft flutter, flutter, flutter against his chest. He turned from the mailbox, from his intended routine, and began the walk back toward the farmhouse. The logic of seasons and survival was being quieted by a smaller, warmer logic. The logic of trying to save a life, simply because he was there and able to. The walk back felt different. His breath fogged before him. The wind seemed less biting. The house lights glowed warmer on the horizon. His hands, though still and protective, felt purposeful in a way they hadn't for years. As he reached the threshold of his kitchen, the smell of wood smoke and old cedar welcomed him. And just before he opened the door, she let out a tiny, soft sneeze against his rough, calloused palm. And yet it comes from nowhere else. It was the softest sound in the world, yet it echoed in the silent kitchen, announcing that a small, wild heart had just entered his home, and nothing would be the same. The heavy wooden door closed very kep. It had a solid, familiar click, instantly shutting out the bite of the wind. Inside, the kitchen was a sanctuary of heat radiating from the black cast iron wood stove that sat in the corner like a faithful, quiet companion. Henry stood motionless on the braided rug for a moment, letting the sudden warmth thaw his cheeks. He hadn't unzipped his jacket yet. He was afraid that if he moved too quickly, the fragile, fluttering weight against his chest might just stop. His house had been quiet for a very long time. It was the kind of quiet that settles into the floorboards and the wallpaper, a silence built over a dozen winters of solitary meals and single cups of coffee. Since his wife passed, those rooms had become perfectly still, a museum of neatly kept memories where nothing was ever out of place and nothing ever changed. The only consistent sound was the slow, rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway, measuring out a life that Henry had accepted would just slowly wind down. But tonight that silence was broken by the faintest, breathy, shivering sound coming from inside his coat, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of a man. Walking on thin ice, Henry crossed the worn linoleum to the large, scarred oak dining table. It was his workbench of sorts, bearing the nicks and gouges of 100 small repairs over the years. From the linen drawer, he pulled a soft, worn flannel washcloth, faded to a pale, buttery yellow, and laid it flat under the warm glow of the overhead pendant light. Gently, he reached into his jacket and cupped the small gray form, transferring her to the center of the cloth. Under the bright kitchen light, she looked even smaller. The cinnamon wash on her flanks was dull vey, kep, tea, hot shock, and her back leg lay at that terrible, unnatural angle. Henry didn't panic. He was a carpenter. He knew how to mend things that were broken, but looking at his own hands, knuckles swollen with mild arthritis, skin thickened by years of handling rough pine and oak, he felt a sudden wave of inadequacy. How could hands that swung hammers and drove lag screws possibly fix something so impossibly delicate? He needed materials. Opening a drawer near the sink, he bypassed the heavy tools and rummaged through a small wooden box of odds and ends. He found a roll of white athletic tape left over from a sprained wrist years ago, and next to his favorite chipped enamel mug on the counter, a stash of flat, wooden coffee stirrers. They were smooth, flexible, and perfectly sized. Returning to the table, Henry washed his hands at the sink. The sharp, clean scent of pine soap cutting through the stale indoor air. He pulled his thick-rimmed reading glasses from his shirt pocket, sliding them down to the very tip of his nose. He caught his reflection in the dark kitchen window for a second, looking exactly like a mad scientist preparing for the world's tiniest, most critical experiment, which brought a soft, breathy chuckle to his lips. He pulled up a wooden chair and leaned in. The pendant light cast a warm, golden circle over them. As he leaned close, he caught her scent. It was tea dirty or wild, as one might expect, but a faint, earthy aroma of dried leaves, cold soil, and a strange, sweet hint of raw cinnamon. Right, little one," Henry whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that hadn't been used much in days. "This is going to be uncomfortable, but we have to get this straight." He reached out with a single, massive index finger and gently touched her injured hip. Immediately, The squirrel's eyes flew open, dark, liquid, and wide with terror. She let out a raspy, indignant chirr, a sound that rattled in her chest like a tiny, stalling lawnmower engine. It was a noise far too large and fiercely brave for a creature that weighed less than an apple, and Henry couldn't help but smile at her sheer audacity. "Mokano ove kep, Mokano ove kep," he murmured, keeping his voice a steady drone, hoping the vibration of it would soothe her. With agonizing slowness, he aligned the tiny bones of her leg. She gave one sharp flinch, her small body going rigid, but she didn't try to bite him. It was as if, in her exhausted state, she understood that fighting the giant was useless. Henry placed the wooden stirrer alongside the leg, his giant, clumsy fingers working vekep ite, at a gentleness he didn't know he still possessed. He tore small, narrow strips of the white tape with his teeth, wrapping them carefully around the wood and fur, securing the splint just tight enough to hold the leg straight. The contrast was stark, the bright, clinical white of the tape against the wild, grizzled gray of her coat. And yet it comes from nowhere else. When the last piece of tape was smoothed down, Henry let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He sat back in his chair, his shoulders dropping, and then the squirrel did something that made Henry's chest ache with a sudden, sharp warmth. Realizing the terrible giant had stopped prodding her, she didn't try to drag herself away. Instead, using her two perfectly fine front paws, she reached up, grabbed the top edge of the yellow flannel washcloth she was lying on, and pulled it directly over her own head. She completely covered her eyes, leaving only her ears and her newly splinted back leg exposed. It was the ultimate, childlike game of hide and seek. If she couldn't see the giant couldn't see her. Henry let out a soft, genuine laugh, the sound foreign, but welcome in the quiet kitchen. He reached over to his chipped enamel mug, wrapping his hands around the cold ceramic just to ground himself. He looked at the tiny yellow lump on his table. For years, he had built sturdy walls, fixed leaky roofs, and sealed windows to keep the unpredictable, messy world outside. He had engineered a perfectly safe, perfectly empty life. Yet here he was, having just spent 30 minutes holding his breath to mend a few inches of hollow bone. As he looked at the white tape binding the small piece of wood to her leg, he realized that in tying that splint, he had inadvertently tethered his own quiet life to hers. He leaned forward again, resting his chin on his hands. Structurally speaking, Henry whispered softly to the hidden squirrel, "That oak stirrer has excellent tensile strength. You'll be weight-bearing in a few weeks, and yet it comes from nowhere else." The yellow washcloth did not respond, but outside, the wind howled against the window panes, and for the first time in a decade, the old farmhouse didn't feel empty at all. The steady, rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway felt different the next morning. Usually, it served as a hollow metronome for a solitary routine, brewing coffee, feeding the wood stove, watching the frost melt off the window panes. But today, the ticking seemed to keep time with the tiny, fragile, heartbeat Henry. Kano Ave Kep was resting in the corner of his kitchen. He had spent the previous evening fashioning a makeshift recovery ward out of an old, slatted wooden apple crate, lining it thick with soft hand towels. The buttery yellow flannel washcloth remained her chosen fortress, draped carefully over the corner where she had retreated the night before. As Henry padded across the cold linoleum in his thick wool socks, the house was still holding the deep chill of a late November dawn. He went through the motions of making his morning coffee, the rich, dark, roasted aroma cutting through the lingering scent of old pine smoke from the stove. It was a comforting, familiar smell, one that usually signaled the start of a long, quiet day. But today, Henry kept glancing over his shoulder at the apple crate. There had been no movement, no sound, and a heavy knot of worry had begun to tighten in his chest. He poured his coffee into the chipped enamel mug, the hot ceramic warming his stiff, arthritic hands, and walked over to the pantry. If the white athletic tape and the coffee stirrer were going to hold her leg, she needed strength to heal. From a glass mason jar on the second shelf, he extracted a single raw almond. He stood there for a moment, rubbing the nut between his heavy, calloused thumb and forefinger. He focused on the sensory weight of it, the dry, dusty ridges, the teardrop shape, the pale brown skin. In his massive palm, it looked like nothing more than a pebble, but to a creature her size, it was a feast. Henry pulled the wooden dining chair close to the crate, the legs scraping softly against the floor. He set his steaming mug down on the table, took a slow, deep breath to calm his own nervous energy, and leaned over the box. The yellow washcloth was completely still. "Breakfast time, little one," Henry whispered, his voice pitching low and soft, like he was trying not to wake a sleeping child. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he lowered his hand into the crate. He rested the back of his knuckles against the soft towels, his palm open to the ceiling, the single almond resting in the center of his lifeline. And then he waited. He knew better than to force it. The wild did not operate on human schedules. It operated on caution, instinct, and a deep-seated fear of anything larger than itself. For 2 full minutes, nothing happened. Henry's shoulder began to ache from holding the awkward position, and his hand developed a slight, involuntary tremor. He focused on keeping his breathing steady, letting the steam from his nearby coffee wash over his forearm. Then, the yellow flannel shifted. Just a fraction of an inch at first. Then, one tiny velvet-tipped nose poked out from beneath the fabric. The black whiskers were vibrating at a frantic pace, sweeping the air, analyzing the foreign smells of roasted coffee, pine soap, and human. The nose retreated, then reappeared, this time followed by 2 dark, liquid eyes and a single, twitching ear. She was staring directly at the giant hand invading her space. She looked from his face, down to his palm, and back up to his face, her tiny chest heaving with rapid, terrified breaths. Henry didn't move a muscle. He didn't blink. He just let her look. She crept out from under the washcloth, her movements slow and hitching as she dragged the splinted, white-taped leg awkwardly behind her. She approached his hand like one might approach a sleeping bear. When she was just an inch from his fingers, she paused, in a move that brought a sudden warm smile to Henry's eyes. She didn't go for the almond right away. Instead, she reached out with her 2 perfectly fine front paws and began to rapidly, furiously pat, pat, pat his thumb. It was an incredibly thorough inspection, tiny claws tapping against his hardened skin as if checking to see if he was a trap waiting to spring. Satisfied that the giant, leathery landscape of his hand was secure, she finally moved her attention to the prize. She didn't take it delicately. With a sudden lightning-fast swipe, she snatched the almond from his palm. But she didn't stay to eat it with him. Immediately, she spun around, dragging her taped leg, and scurried to the farthest corner of the apple crate. She hunched her shoulders, turning her back to him completely, and tucked her head down, hiding the nut against her chest. Henry let out a soft, breathy chuckle, feeling very much like a dismissed waiter at a fussy restaurant. "All right," he murmured fondly. "Privacy it is." He listened as the kitchen filled with a new, beautiful sound. The rapid, rhythmic scratch of her tiny teeth shaving down the hard shell of the almond. It was the sound of survival, the sound of an appetite returning. Henry picked up his chipped enamel mug, leaning back in his wooden chair, and just watched the top of her grizzled gray head bob as she ate. The quiet reflection hit him then, settling deep in his ribs. For years, he had intentionally isolated himself. He hadn't wanted to be relied upon, hadn't wanted the burden of someone else's well-being, because losing things you cared for simply hurt too much. He had built a life so sturdy and empty that nothing could break it. Yet, as he looked at the tiny creature who had just risked her fragile life to take food from his trembling hand, he felt the icy walls of his solitude cracking. She hadn't trusted him completely. Not yet. She still had to turn her back to feel safe, but she had crossed the terrifying distance of that apple crate, inch by cautious inch, and chosen to take a chance on the giant. And in doing so, she had unknowingly asked the giant to take a chance on her. 10 days had passed since the great oak had relinquished its tiny tenant to the frozen ground, and the walls of the apple crate were beginning to look less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. The athletic tape on her leg was no longer a pristine, clinical white. It had taken on a dingy, well-worn gray, matching the grizzled fur of her coat. She had grown stronger, her appetite voracious, and the soft, buttery yellow washcloth now served as a launch pad for her restless, albeit clumsy, acrobatics within the narrow wooden slats. Henry knew the time had come. If the coffee stirrer splint was doing its job, she needed to test the structural integrity. She needed floor time. Henry, it comes from nowhere else, had spent the better part of the morning entirely rearranging his living room, a space that hadn't seen a rearranging in over a decade, moving with the focused intensity of an air traffic controller. He relocated his sturdy leather work boots to the porch, shifted a precarious stack of old seed catalogs onto a high shelf, and even tucked the heavy cast iron doorstop out of sight. He was baby-proofing a house for a creature the size of a large baking potato, a realization that brought a slow, self-deprecating smile to his weathered face. Satisfied that the terrain was clear, Henry lowered himself onto the center of the large, braided wool row you-go that dominated the room. His knees gave a chorus of dry pops, a stark reminder of his own accumulating miles, as he settled into a cross-legged position. He ran his heavy hand over the spiraled texture of the rug, feeling the coarse dyed wool fibers rough beneath his calluses. The late afternoon winter sun was slicing through the frost-rimmed window panes, casting long, golden geometric shapes across the floor and illuminating a million tiny, dust motes dancing in the quiet air. He carefully brought the apple crate into the room and set it gently on the floor beside him. Reaching in, he didn't need the single almond to coax her anymore. She immediately scrambled into his waiting palm, her tiny claws pricking lightly against his skin. He lowered his hand to the rug, directly into a pool of warm sunlight. "All right, little one," Henry murmured, his gravelly voice dropping to a low, encouraging hum. "Let's see what we've got." She stepped off his hand, her front paws sinking slightly into the thick wool of the rug. For a moment, she just stood there, vibrating with the sensory overload of open space. She twitched her nose, taking in the scent of old wood ash from the fireplace and the lingering ghost of Henry S. pine soap. Then came the quirky, undeniable reality of her situation. Feeling an itch, she instinctively raised her injured leg to scratch behind her ear. But the oak coffee stirrer held firm. Instead of reaching her ear, the white-taped leg simply poked straight out into the air, like a tiny, furry flagpole. She held it there for a second, confused. She lowered it, turned her head to glare back at her own hip, with an expression of profound, offended betrayal, and let out a short, raspy chitter, scolding her own limb for its insubordination. And yet it comes from nowhere else. Henry covered his mouth with the back of his hand to muffle a bark of laughter, not wanting to spook her. Determined to move forward despite the betrayal of her anatomy, she took her first step. It was the graceful, fluid leap of a wild squirrel. It was a comically awkward, tripod gait. She would reach forward with her front paws, give a little hopve, kepite hat her good back leg, and then swing the splinted leg around in a wide arc. Hop, drag, thump. The tiny hollow sound of the wood hitting the floorboards just beyond the rug echoed in the quiet room. Hop, drag, thump. Henry watched her navigate the vast, intimidating expanse of the braided rug. She looked so small, so thoroughly mismatched to the world around her, yet she moved with an absolute, fiery determination. She didn't cower. She didn't surrender to the stiffness of the splint or the awkwardness of the drag. She just pete, her dark eyes fixed on the leg of his armchair across the room, figuring out the geometry of her new limitation. Ve kepite had every clumsy step. Sitting there in the dust-moted sunlight, a quiet, heavy reflection settled over Henry. For years, he had treated his own grief like a broken bone that he refused to set. When his house had gone quiet, he had simply stopped walking. He had isolated himself, convinced that a life with a limp wasn't a life worth navigating, that moving forward with a heavy, broken heart was too awkward, too painful, too publicly clumsy. He had engineered a life of stillness to avoid the dragging and the thumping. Yet, here was this tiny, fragile thing, dragging a coffee stirrer taped to her hip, boldly conquering a wool rug like it was the highest canopy in the forest. Healing, Henry realized as he watched her, was about returning to perfect grace. It was about the messy, awkward courage to try. It was the willingness to look foolish, to stumble, to make a new sound against the floorboards, and to keep moving anyway. She had made it halfway across the rug when she suddenly changed her trajectory. Abandoning her mission toward the armchair, she pivoted and began her hop, drag, thump ma, a road hat, directly back toward Henry. She navigated the treacherous mountains of the braided wool, finally reaching his leg. Without a moment's hesitation, she clambered up the side of his thick wool sock, using her front claws to scale the vertical cliff of his ankle. She hauled herself. She trips onto the bridge of his foot, dragging the stiff white peg leg behind her. Finding the highest, warmest point right over his arch, she sat down heavily, wrapped her thick gray tail around herself like a damp mop, and looked up at him. She let out a soft, contented sigh, having successfully summited the giant. Henry looked down at the tiny, triumphant weight on his foot. The winter sun warmed his face, and his joints ached from sitting on the floor. But as he gently rested his massive hand just inches from her resting body, he felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation blooming in his chest. It felt terrifyingly like a new beginning. Barnaby was not a hunter. In his distant, hazy youth, he might have been a formidable mouser out in the drafts of the old barn, but time and a fondness for uninterrupted naps had turned the large, orange tabby into something closely resembling a furry, breathing sofa cushion, and yet it comes from nowhere else. He had moved indoors permanently 3 winters ago, his own hips growing too stiff for the cold nights, and he now spent his days migrating from one sunny patch of the floorboards to the next. He was Henry S., silent, undemanding roommate, a creature of deep routine, who mostly communicated through heavy sighs and a slow, judgmental blinking of his pale green eyes. When the tiny, chattering new resident had first arrived in her wooden apple crate, Barnaby had merely twitched an ear from his spot by the wood stove, deemed the smells of pine soap and medicinal tape utterly unappetizing, and gone back to sleep. But as her floor time became a daily occurrence, the inevitable intersection of their orbits grew closer. The official introduction happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Henry was sitting in his worn armchair, the chipped enamel mug resting on his knee, his body coiled with a low-grade, protective tension. The squirrel was making her familiar hop, drag, thump patrol across the braided wool rug, her coffee stir tapping a steady rhythm. Barnaby, meanwhile, was sprawled exactly in the center of the rug, soaking up a square of bright, dusty sunlight. He was laid out flat on his side, a massive expanse of sun-baked orange fur that smelled faintly of dry dust and warm wool. Henry held his breath as the squirrel's clumsy trajectory put her on a direct collision course with the sleeping cat. The wild dictates that predator and prey do not casually mingle. Instinct is an ancient, rigid law. Henry's heavy hand hovered inches above his knee, ready to spring forward and scoop her up at the first sign of a flattened ear or a swishing tail. The squirrel paused just inches from Barnaby's massive, sleeping head. She sat up on her good hind leg, her splinted limb sticking out stiffly to the side, and analyzed the giant orange mountain blocking her path. Her whiskers twitched furiously. Then, she did something completely devoid of survival instinct. She had been carrying a prize, half of a walnut Henry had given her, tucked securely in her mouth. Recognizing that this orange mountain radiated a tremendous amount of heat, she decided it was not a threat, but rather an excellent premium location to store her valuables. She hopped right up against Barnaby's soft underbelly. With her 2 tiny front paws, she began to frantically, vigorously dig into the thick, dense forest of his orange fur. Barnaby opened one pale green eye. He looked down at the tiny gray creature currently excavating his stomach. Henry tensed, his heart leaping into his throat. "Barnaby, no," he whispered, a sharp warning. But the cat merely let out a long, wheezing sigh. He didn't lift his head. He didn't raise a paw. He simply closed his eye again, resigning himself to the indignity. Finding the fur sufficiently parted, the squirrel shoved the walnut half deep into Barnaby's flank. Then, with the meticulous care of a master gardener, she used her front paws to rapidly pat the orange fur back into place, smoothing it down over her hidden treasure. Satisfied with her work, she didn't leave. Instead, she let out a soft, tired chitter, turned in a tiny circle, and collapsed right against the curve of Barnaby's stomach. She draped her stiff, taped leg over his lower back, tucked her nose under her own gray tail, and closed her eyes. A moment later, a sound began to fill the quiet room. It was a deep, resonant, rattling purr, vibrating like a distant diesel engine idling in the driveway. The sound was so strong, Henry could feel the subtle vibration of it through the soles of his wool socks on the floorboards. Barnaby was purring, and the tiny squirrel was rising and falling with the rhythmic breathing of her former natural enemy. Henry slowly leaned back in his armchair, letting out a breath he felt he had been holding for days. He lifted his mug to his lips, hiding a wide, disbelieving smile behind the ceramic rim. He watched them sleep for a long time, the dusty sunlight slowly inching across the floor, painting them in gold. As he sat in the quiet warmth, a profound reflection washed over him. For years, he had believed in the absolute rigidity of the world. Predators hunted, prey hid, the young left, the old stayed behind. Grief was a solitary sentence, and a broken heart was a permanent condition. He had built his walls high because he thought the laws of nature and of life were cruel and unchanging. Yet, looking at the tiny gray squirrel nestled perfectly in the orange fur of a barn cat, he saw the beautiful, chaotic flaw in his logic. The world was too rigid at all. Sometimes the desperate, fundamental need for warmth and companionship could override the oldest instincts in the blood. If a wild squirrel and an old tomcat could rewrite the rules of nature simply because the sun felt good and the floor was cold, then perhaps Henry's own rules weren't so permanent either. And yet it comes from nowhere else. He looked around his living room at the moved boots and the stacked catalogs, at the apple crate in the corner and the sleeping odd couple on his rug. The silence from nowhere else. The silence of the house had been thoroughly, wonderfully broken, replaced by the thumping of a wooden splint and the rumbling engine of an old cat's purr. Henry rested his head against the back of his chair, closing his eyes, letting the combined warmth of the fire and the strange, impossible peace of the room settle deep into his bones. Deep winter arrived in January, wrapping the old farmhouse in a thick, muffling blanket of pure white. The snow drifted high against the storm windows, and the wind coming off the sprawling woods howled a hollow, lonely tune that rattled the loose panes of glass. In years past, this was the season Henry simply endured rather than lived, a time of long shadows and deep silence, where the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock felt like a heavy, physical weight pressing down on the empty rooms. But this winter, the biting cold outside was entirely powerless. against the profound, bustling warmth that had taken root inside his home. The first major milestone of this new, quiet season had been the removal of the makeshift splint. On a still Tuesday morning, Henry had gently scooped her up from her yellow flannel washcloth, setting her on the large oak dining table under the bright pendant light. With infinite care, using a pair of small sewing scissors, he had snipped the dingy, graying, athletic tape. The wooden coffee stirrer fell away with a soft, hollow clatter against the wood. Underneath, her fur was matted, and the leg looked impossibly thin, holding a slight tremble. As he set her down on the floorboards, Henry held his breath, his large hands hovering just in case she fell. She took one cautious, hobbling step, then another. There was a slight hitch in her gait, a tiny ghost of a limp, but the bone held firm. The realization seemed to wash over her all at once. She didn't just walk. She launched herself, with it comes from nowhere else. With a joyous, frantic burst of kinetic energy, she rocketed across the braided wool rug, ricocheted off the side of the faded sofa, and scrambled straight up the heavy linen curtains, clinging near the ceiling like a triumphant gray burr. Henry had stood in the center of the room, his calloused hands resting on his hips, and let out a deep, booming laugh that startled even himself, a rich, echoing sound that shook the dust from the rafters and chased the last lingering shadows of his solitude away. With her mobility fully restored, her personality blossomed, revealing a creature of boundless curiosity and highly specific, quirky opinions. The house became her sprawling territory, and Henry quickly learned that wild instincts, when brought indoors, translated into glorious, harmless mischief. Her most defining quirk emerged on laundry days. Henry soon realized that he was consistently coming up short on winter footwear. It wasn't just any sock she was after. She had absolutely no interest in his thin summer cottons or the dark dress socks he wore to church. She was solely, obsessively dedicated to stealing his thick gray worsted wool socks, and, for reasons known only to her wild little heart, she seemed to prefer the left ones, perhaps because they held the shape of his slightly wider foot. The theft was a daily theatrical performance. Henry would sit in his armchair, sipping from his chipped enamel mug, pretending to read the paper while secretly watching as she casually sauntered into his bedroom. A moment later, she would emerge, walking backward on her three good legs and dragging a massive, heavy gray wool sock clamped firmly in her tiny jaws. The sock was easily twice tiny tugboat hauling a massive barge, hauling a massive barge across the linoleum. Scritch, scratch, slide. She would laboriously row her prize across the floor, pausing occasionally to catch her breath, glaring at Henry as if daring him to intervene, before disappearing into the dark gap beneath his sturdy oak dresser. He had looked under there once with a flashlight and found a sprawling architectural marvel of a nest woven from 3 gray socks, a shredded seed catalog, and, sitting proudly in the center of the chaos, her original buttery yellow washcloth. He didn't have the heart to reclaim his laundry. He simply drove to the hardware store and started buying more socks. The mornings took on a beautiful, chaotic sensory rhythm. Henry would wake in the dark, the air in the bedroom holding the sharp blue chill of a sub-zero dawn. But before his feet even hit the freezing floorboards, he would hear it. The soft thump of Barnaby jumping down from the bed, followed immediately by the rapid pitter, patter of tiny claws chasing the orange cat down the hallway. By the time Henry reached the kitchen, the smell of dark roasted coffee would mix with the rich scent of dry wood ash as he stoked the cast iron stove, while the squirrel used Barnaby's sleeping, sprawling body as a springboard to reach the lower pantry shelves. Barnaby had completely surrendered to his role as an honorary jungle gym and heated mattress. It was not uncommon for Henry to walk into the living room and find the massive orange tabby asleep on the rug, with the squirrel draped shamelessly across the top of his head, her bushy tail resting right between the cat's pale green eyes, like a ridiculous, fuzzy winter hat. Sitting in his chair one evening, the fire popping brightly in the grate, Henry watched the two of them sleeping in a tangled, multi-species heap. A quiet, profound reflection settled softly over his chest. For over a decade, he had thought he was protecting himself by keeping his life empty. He had believed that avoiding attachments was the only reliable way to avoid the inevitable pain of losing them. He had been so proud of his neatly stacked woodpile, his tightly weather-stripped windows, his perfectly square, impenetrable life. But as he listened to the rattling purr of the old cat and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the tiny squirrel he had pulled from the freezing dirt, Henry realized the terrible, beautiful truth. A house perfectly sealed against the cold is also perfectly sealed against the light, and yet it comes from nowhere else. His hands, rough and scarred from a lifetime of building walls, were finally learning how to leave the doors open. He took a slow, warm sip from his mug, feeling the deep, aching comfort of a man who was no longer just waiting for the winter to pass, but was finally truly living in the warmth of it. March arrived at the old farmhouse, not with a sudden burst of warmth, but with a slow, relentless dripping. The heavy icicles that had clung stubbornly to the eaves all winter began to weep, sounding a steady, rhythmic plink, plink, plink against the weathered Steverton flashing of the porch roof. The world outside the storm windows was transforming from a sterile, blinding white into a chaotic canvas of muddy browns and bruised greens. When Henry cracked the kitchen door to bring in firewood, the air no longer smelled of sterile frost. It carried the deep, rich, intoxicating scent of thawing earth, wet pine needles, and the ancient, waking woods. Inside the house, a parallel shift was occurring, subtle at first, but impossible for a man attuned to quiet routines to ignore. The tiny gray squirrel was fully, spectacularly healed. The awkward, endearing tripod hop that had defined her early days on the braided wool rug was entirely gone. Without the clumsy oak coffee stirrer holding her back, she had become a creature of liquid lightning. She didn't just climb the heavy linen curtains anymore. She flowed up them, her movements so fast and fluid they blurred in the corners of Henriette's vision. Her coat, once dull and matted with shock, was now a thick, luxurious silver gray, the cinnamon wash on her flanks glowing warmly in the shifting spring light. But with the return of her physical strength came the awakening of something older and far more powerful than the safety of the farmhouse. The wild was calling, whispering to her through the cracks in the floorboards, and the drafty window panes, and she was listening. Her routines changed. The grand thefts of Henry S. left wool socks ceased entirely. Her sprawling architectural nest beneath the oak dresser lay largely ignored. The buttery yellow washcloth sitting abandoned in the center, like a retired flag. Instead, her entire universe narrowed down to the 3 large windows facing the front yard and the giant oak tree beyond. Her new, quirky obsession brought a bittersweet smile to Henry's face every morning. She would scramble up the back of the sofa to wide wooden windowsill. There, she would stand rigidly on her 2 perfectly healed hind legs, her tiny front paws pressed flat against the cold glass. But it was to just staring. If Henry gave her a peanut, her absolute favorite treat, she no longer sat on his shoulder or nestled into Barnaby's fur to eat it. She would carry it to the windowsill, press the nut against the smooth, unyielding glass, and begin to frantically, furiously, pat, pat, pat at the invisible barrier, trying to bury her treasure in the sky. She would pause, look incredibly offended that the air was solid, reposition the peanut a few inches to the left, and begin the furious patting all over again. The glass isn't going to give way. "Little one," Henry murmured one afternoon, leaning against the doorframe with his hands tucked into his pockets, watching her tireless excavation efforts. The structural integrity of that pane is pretty sound. She ignored him, chattering softly at a pair of blue jays, bickerings in the high branches of her ancestral oak, her tail flicking in sharp, agitated arcs. Even Barnaby felt the shift. The large orange tabby would amble over to the window, letting out a long, questioning trill, waiting for his tiny gray hat to descend and playfully dig in his fur when she merely glanced down at him before returning her intense focus to the world outside. Barnaby would let out a heavy, incredibly dramatic sigh of offense, turning his back and flopping onto the rug with the air of a deeply neglected monarch. Henry retreated to his armchair, his chipped enamel mug resting warm against his palm. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the dark roast tasting suddenly bitter. He watched the silhouette of the squirrel, backlit by the pressed against the glass, her tiny paws still pressed against the glass. The quiet, heavy reflection he had been holding at bay for weeks finally settled squarely on his chest. And yet it comes from nowhere else. When he had found her shivering and broken at the base of the tree, he had acted out of a desperate, selfish need to fix something. In the long, quiet winter months that followed, he had allowed himself to believe they were building a life together in this closed ecosystem. He had loved the noise, the chaos, the tiny heartbeat that filled the empty corners of his home. But as he watched her frantic pacing along the windowsill, the truth was undeniable. He had mended a wild thing, but he hadn't tamed it, and he shouldn't want to. To love a creature of the woods wasn't about containment. It was about stewardship. She didn't belong to him. She belonged to the damp earth, the high canopies, the chaotic, dangerous, beautiful world on the other side of that glass. He had been a way station, a warm place to heal, but her lease on the indoors was expiring with the melting snow. He rested his head back against the worn leather of his chair, closing his eyes and listening to the faint, rapid thump, thump, thump of her paws pacing the wooden sill. The sound was no longer a rhythm of comforting companionship. It was a drumbeat of departure. The house was going to be quiet again, and this time, Henry knew the silence was going to be much, much louder than before. It was a Tuesday in mid-April when the quiet crisis finally broke. The morning dawned with a piercing, crystalline clarity. The sky a bright, scrubbed blue that felt vast and bottomless. The frost had retreated entirely into the earth, and in its place the damp, loamy smell of waking soil and budding green things hung heavy in the air. Inside the farmhouse, the grandfather clock ticked its steady rhythm in the hallway, completely oblivious to the heavy bittersweet tension that had settled over the kitchen. Henry stood by the stove, holding his chipped enamel mug. The coffee was hot, sending a thin ribbon of fragrant steam into the air, but he hadn't taken a sip. He was watching the living room window. She was there, of course. She had been there since the first light turned the glass gray, engaged in her frantic, tireless pat, pat, pat against the invisible barrier. But today, the energy was different. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a desperate, urgent vibration. Her silver-gray tail was flicking in sharp, erratic jerks, and every few seconds, she would let out a low, distressed chitter, a sound that physically tugged at the center of Henriette's chest. The wild wasn't tee just whispering to her anymore. It was shouting. Barnaby was seated a few feet away on the braided wool rug, his tail wrapped neatly around his massive orange paws. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching her with a calm, unblinking intensity, perhaps understanding the ancient language of departure far better than the man standing in the kitchen. Henry set his mug down on the counter. The ceramic made a soft, hollow clink against the wood. He wiped his calloused palms on his faded denim jeans, took a slow, deep breath that tasted of pine soap and wood ash, and walked toward the heavy front door. His boots made no sound against the rug, but she stopped her frantic pacing the moment he reached the entryway. She dropped to all fours on the windowsill, her dark, liquid eyes tracking his every movement. Henry reached out and grasped the cool brass deadbolt, and yet it comes from nowhere else. He turned it with a solid, echoing thwack. He gripped the handle, pressed his thumb down on the latch, and pulled the heavy wooden door open to the crisp spring morning. The sensory shift was immediate and overwhelming. A rush of cold, damp air flooded the warm, stagnant space of the living room. It carried the sharp, peppery scent of wet pine needles, the muddy perfume of the thawing yard, and the distant, chaotic chirping of a dozen unseen birds. The tinny, hollow song of the wind chimes on the porch rang out like a sudden announcement. Barnaby took one delicate sniff of the aggressive, chilly outdoor air, pinned his ears back in profound disgust, and immediately trotted away to curl up behind the radiating heat of the cast-iron stove. The great outdoors was entirely too hot effort for a Tuesday. The squirrel, however, froze. She leaped from the windowsill down to the back of the sofa, and then dropped softly onto the braided rug. She moved toward the open doorway with a low, slinking, cautious crawl, her belly nearly brushing the floorboards. When she reached the threshold, the exact line where the warm indoor linoleum met the weathered, painted wood of the front porch, she performed a quirky, utterly baffling maneuver. Having spent the last month intimately acquainted with The unyielding nature of windows, she simply couldn't comprehend an unobstructed exit. She stood up tall on her hind legs, right at the edge of the open doorway, extended her tiny front paws, and began to furiously pat, pat, pat at the completely empty air. She swiped at the breeze. Leaning forward, looking incredibly offended and deeply confused that her invisible force field was suddenly missing. Henry, leaning against the doorframe, let out a soft, watery chuckle, bringing a heavy knuckle up to wipe the corner of his eye. "It's open, little one," he murmured, his gravelly voice trembling just a fraction. "No glass this time." She dropped back to all fours, her whiskers vibrating like tuning forks as they processed the rush of wild scents. She took one hesitant step onto the porch. Her small claws clicked against the exterior wood, a distinctly different sound than the soft thump she used to make with her wooden splint. She took another step, then paused. And yet it comes from nowhere else, in a moment that Henry would replay in mind for years. She slowly turned her grizzled head back toward the living room. She looked past the doorframe, past the braided rug, directly at the giant man who had held her when she was broken. She didn't chitter. She didn't run. She just held his gaze for 3 long, impossibly quiet heartbeats. "Go on," Henry whispered, forcing a tight, reassuring smile onto his weathered face. "Don't go stealing any left socks out there. They won't do you much good in the rain." As if given the final, necessary permission, she turned back to the yard. She didn't walk. She exploded. She became a silver-gray blur, launching off the porch steps and tearing across terrifying speed, with breathtaking, terrifying speed. She didn't look back again. She hit the trunk of the ancient oak tree and flowed upward, spiraling around the rough bark until she disappeared entirely into the high, tangled canopy of budding branches. Henry stood in the open doorway for a very long time, the cold wind biting through his flannel shirt, listening to the wind chimes and the silence she had left behind. A profound, aching reflection settled deep into his bones. For years, he had believed that loving something meant keeping it safe behind locked doors. He had built his solitary life on the premise that holding on was the only way to avoid the pain of losing. But as he looked at the empty expanse of the great oak, he realized the beautiful, painful truth. True sanctuary wasn't a cage you kept perfectly sealed. It was a warm place you offered, knowing full well the door must eventually open. Letting her go wasn't a loss. It was the ultimate, brave completion of the promise he had made when he first picked her up from the freezing dirt. He slowly pulled the heavy door shut, the latch clicking with a devastating finality. He walked back into the living room, picking up his cold coffee. The house was exactly as it had been before November, yet it felt entirely different. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was overwhelmingly, deafeningly empty. He glanced toward the bedroom hallway, imagining the small, abandoned yellow washcloth sitting under his dresser. And for the first time in a decade, Henry sat down in his armchair and simply let himself cry. Let himself cry. The heavy, humid days of summer rolled over the old farmhouse, thick and suffocating, swallowing the crisp memory of spring. The great oak tree had exploded into a dense, impenetrable canopy of dark green, hiding 100 frantic, chattering secrets within its leaves. Through the long, hot months, Henry had kept the living room window cracked open, sitting in his armchair late into the evening, listening. He heard the trill of tree frogs, the haunting call of a distant screech owl, and the territorial scolding of the resident squirrels. But he never heard that specific raspy chirr, and he never saw a flash of silver gray with a cinnamon wash bounding across the porch. By late October, the season finally broke. The humid air snapped, replaced by the sharp metallic tang of the autumn wind. The giant oak transformed, its leaves turning a brilliant, bruised gold and deep amber before beginning their slow, dry descent to the earth. Pert. Henry found himself spending more and more time out in the vast emptying yard. His hands, which had once been content to remain idle in the quiet of his solitary life, now sought constant, nervous work. He built small, sturdy feeder boxes, measuring the cuts with meticulous care, and mounted them to the trunks of the maples and the pines lining the driveway. Every morning, he filled them with raw almonds, black oil sunflower seeds, and whole peanuts. It was a gentle, foolish ritual, and he knew it. He would stand on the porch with his chipped enamel mug, his breath blooming in the frosty morning air, and watch the feeding frenzy. He was looking for a ghost. He scrutinized every squirrel that darted down the bark, searching for a tiny hesitation in a back leg, a specific, erratic flick of a silver tail, or a pair of dark eyes that held a spark of recognition. But the creatures that came to his feeders were fiercely wild and entirely indifferent to the giant watching them. They snatched the food and fled. To add insult to his quiet heartbreak, a family of aggressive blue jays had discovered his offerings. They would swoop down in a flash of cobalt, screaming their chaotic demands, and scatter the carefully placed almonds. Henry found himself waving his heavy, calloused hand at them from the porch, muttering, "Those aren't tea for you, you noisy thieves," before letting out a soft, self-deprecating chuckle at the sheer absurdity of arguing with a bird over a peanut. Inside the farmhouse, the echo of her absence was felt most acutely by Barnaby. The large orange tabby had spent the summer seeking out the coolest, darkest corners of the house, but as the autumn chill crept back through the floorboards, he returned to his sunny spot on the braided wool rug. Occasionally, Henry would watch the old cat wake from a deep sleep, let out a soft, questioning trill at the empty air, and look around with narrowed, deeply annoyed green eyes. It was as if Barnaby was profoundly offended that his favorite vibrating gray winter hat had failed to report for duty. Getting no response, the cat would unleash a long, wheezing sigh of utter neglect and go back to sleep, leaving Henry to smile sadly into his coffee. On a Tuesday afternoon, beneath a sky the color of hammered lead, Henry decided to cut back the dying perennials in the flower beds lining the front porch. The air was rich with the sensory perfume of autumn, the sharp scent of crushed, dry oak leaves mixed with the dark, damp, metallic smell of cold soil. He knelt in the dirt, his heavy canvas work pants soaking up the moisture from the ground, and began pulling up the withered, brown stalks of the hostas. And yet it comes from nowhere else. He drove his hand trowel deep into the earth near the wooden porch lattice, hitting something soft that didn't yield like a root. Frowning, he dug around the object with his thick, dirt-stained fingers, gently pulling it free from the damp loam. He sat back on his heels, a sudden, breathy laugh escaping his lips, quickly followed by a sharp, unexpected sting behind his eyes. There, caked in cold mud and heavily weathered by months of rain, was one of his thick, worsted wool winter socks. A left one, naturally. He brushed the heavy dirt away from the gray fabric. It was heavy and bulging in the toe, with trembling fingers. He pulled the cuff open and turned it upside down. 3 pristine, perfectly preserved acorns tumbled out into his massive palm. Sometime in the chaotic, muddy weeks of early spring, before the final call of the wild had pulled her away completely, she had undertaken a secret mission. She hadn't just stolen his sock to build a nest under his dresser. She had stolen one to use as a heavy-duty, woolen vault for her treasures in the great outdoors. It was a spectacular, quirky collision, and her absolute instincts in the utility of Henry's laundry. Henry sat in the cold dirt for a long time, holding the mud-stained sock in one hand and the 3 acorns in the other. A quiet, heavy reflection settled over him, settling deep in his ribs where the lonely ache had taken up residence. He had spent his life building things that lasted. Furniture, walls, sturdy roofs. He liked outcomes he could measure and predict. But loving a wild thing was an entirely different kind of carpentry. He realized then that the true weight of loving her wasn't the burden of the midnight feedings, or the worry over her splint, or even the chaos of her boundless energy. The true agonizing weight of it was the not knowing. It was the vast, silent, indifferent expanse of the woods that offered no reassurances and gave no updates. He didn't know if she had outrun the hawks, if she had found a warm hollow for the impending winter, or if she remembered the smell of pine soap and the safety of the yellow washcloth. He slipped the 3 acorns into his jacket pocket and carefully folded the ruined, beautiful left sock, tucking it away. He stood up, his knees popping in the cold air, and looked out at the sprawling, silent woods. He had to accept the heartbreak as the absolute necessary price of the winter's Ep's joy. She was out there, somewhere, woven into the tapestry of the falling leaves, and Henry finally understood that a heart broken open by love is vastly superior to one kept perfectly, safely empty. Late November brought the frost back to the old farmhouse, painting the sprawling woods in sharp, glittering strokes of silver and white. Almost exactly a year had passed since the great oak tree had dropped its tiny, broken secret into the freezing leaves. The sprawling canopy was bare once more, its black branches scratching at a pale, overcast sky. Henry's morning routine had settled back into its familiar, solitary rhythm. He woke in the dark, stoked the cast iron stove, and stood on the porch with his chipped enamel mug, watching the sun struggle to break over the tree line. The air was bitterly cold, holding that sharp metallic bite that stung the inside of his nostrils and made his breath billow in thick white clouds. He wrapped his large, calloused hands tightly around the hot ceramic of his mug, relishing the contrast of the heat against his stiff joints. He looked out at the empty yard, his gaze automatically tracing the line of the oak tree's trunk. A muscle memory his heart still refused to abandon. Then he heard it. It wasn't the chaotic, screaming demand of a blue jay, nor the distant, hollow knocking of a woodpecker. It was a sharp, rapid, scolding chitter that cut through the frozen morning air like a tiny electric wire. Henry froze, his mug halfway to his lips. He didn't dare turn his head too quickly. He tracked the sound with only his eyes, scanning the frosted expanse of the front yard. A silver-gray blur was moving down the trunk of the ancient oak. It didn't pause at the base. It bounded across the crunchy, frost-covered grass with liquid speed, a streak of kinetic energy against the bleak landscape. The blur hit the wooden porch lattice, spiraled up the side of the post, and landed with a soft, confident thump directly on the frosted wooden railing, scarcely 3 feet from where Henry was standing. Henry stopped breathing. His heart gave a massive, painful lurch against his ribs. She looked entirely different, yet unmistakably the same. The wild had changed her. She was no longer the fragile, terrified juvenile that had lived in an apple crate. She had filled out magnificently, her winter coat thick and luxurious, a brilliant, grizzled, silver gray that looked incredibly warm against the stark morning. The cinnamon wash on her flanks was vibrant, and her plumed tail was a massive, majestic flag sweeping behind her. She sat up on her hind legs and stared directly into Henry's face. She didn't look frightened. She looked expectantly annoyed. Henry was so stunned. He couldn't form a word. He just stood there like a great flannel-clad statue. Apparently, his lack of immediate service was unacceptable to her wild sensibilities. She dropped her front paws to the wooden rail and began to furiously, rapidly pat against the frost-covered wood. Tap, 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 tap. When Henry still didn't move, she leaned forward and let out a raspy, indignant chirr, that exact, unmistakable sound of a tiny, stalling lawnmower engine. "Hey, giant!" Her posture seemed to scream, "Where is my breakfast?" The sheer, staggering audacity of it broke the spell. Henry let out a sudden, watery bark of laughter, his hand shaking so badly. He splashed a small wave of hot, dark coffee over the rim of his chipped mug and right onto the toe of his leather work boot. He didn't even feel the heat. "Well, mot luglunk be," Henry whispered, his gravelly voice cracking down the middle. "Look at you." By some foolish, hopeful miracle, he still kept a few raw almonds in the left pocket of his jacket, a habit he hadn't been able to break all summer. Moving they kept a hat, excruciating slowness, terrified she would bolt. At the first sign of motion, he reached into his pocket, pinched a single almond. He pinched a single almond between his heavy thumb and forefinger and slowly extended his hand over the railing. She didn't snatch it and run. She didn't cower. As she hopped forward to bridge the gap, Henry's breath hitched. There it was, a tiny, almost imperceptible hesitation in her back leg when she pushed off, a microscopic hitch in her otherwise flawless grace. It was the ghost of the white athletic tape and the oak coffee stirrer, the permanent signature of their shared history. She took the almond delicately from his trembling fingers. Then, instead of fleeing to the high branches of the oak, she simply sat back on her haunches, right there on the frosty porch rail, and began the familiar, rapid scritch of her teeth against the shell. A muffled, dramatic thud against the glass behind Henry broke the quiet of the morning. He turned his head slightly to see Barnaby. The large orange tabby was standing on his hind legs, his two front paws pressed flat against the living room window. The cat's nose was squished hilariously against the glass, leaving a foggy smudge of condensation as he let out a long, muffled, deeply complaining trill. The squirrel paused her chewing. She looked past Henriette's shoulder, spotted the squished orange face in the window, and gave her thick silver tail a single casual flick. A wildly casual greeting to her former heated mattress before going right back to her almond. And yet it comes from nowhere else. Henry leaned back against the porch post, the cold wood biting through his jacket, and let the tears he hadn't realized he was holding finally spill over his weathered cheeks. A profound, quiet reflection settled into the very foundation of his soul. For a year, he had grieved her absence, believing that the wild had simply reclaimed her and erased him from her memory. He had thought their bond was a product of her captivity, born only of necessity and the confines of the farmhouse walls. But as he watched her eat her almond in the freezing wind, he realized the magnificent, breathtaking truth. She had possessed the entire sprawling forest. She had survived the hawks, the summer storms, and the vast, indifferent wild. She was entirely free. Yet, when the frost returned, she had actively chosen to come back. She had remembered the house, the porch, and the giant who smelled of pine soap. Love, Henry finally understood, was not the act of holding something tightly in your hands to keep it safe. It was the terrifying, beautiful act of leaving your hands entirely open and finding that a wild heart might just choose to land there anyway. The wind chimes rang out a soft, tinny melody in the breeze. She finished her almond, wiped her tiny whiskers capite, pat her front paws, and looked up at him again. The farmhouse was no longer a place of quiet waiting. The world had come back to his doorstep. The initial shock of her return slowly melted into a deep, radiating warmth that settled in the center of Henriette's chest, completely neutralizing the bitter November wind. He stood on the porch, watching her finish the last crumbs of the almond. A powerful, nostalgic instinct immediately took over. The natural order of things, as Henry understood it from the previous winter, dictated that the next step was sanctuary. It was freezing outside, the frost thick and biting, and his house was full of radiating heat, soft flannel, and an orange cat who doubled as a mattress. Holding his chipped enamel mug in one hand, Henry reached behind him and grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door. He pushed it open, the hinges giving a familiar metallic groan. Instantly, a wave of warm air, carrying the rich scents of roasting coffee and aged cedar, spilled out onto the frosty porch. Through the glass, Barnaby had seen the door opening. Having zero interest in the aggressive, biting cold of the outdoors, the large orange tabby immediately abandoned his post at the window. With a dismissive flick of his tail, he trotted swiftly back to the center of the braided wool rug, curling into a tight, secure orange croissant near the wood stove. Henry stepped back, leaving the doorway wide open. "All right, little one," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly invitation. "Come on in out of the wind. Your old yellow washcloth is still under the dresser if you want it." She dropped to all fours on the porch railing. She hopped down to the weathered floorboards. The ghost of a hitch in her step visible only to the man who had taped the splint. She moved toward the open doorway, her silver-gray tail trailing behind her. She reached the threshold, pausing exactly where the exterior wood met the warm indoor linoleum. She stretched her neck forward, her whiskers vibrating as she took a long, deep sniff of the house. Henry smiled, expecting her to bound inside, perhaps to launch herself onto the sofa or scurry straight to the pantry shelves. But she didn't cross the line. In a perfectly quirky display of wild logic, she seemed to assess the warm, stagnant air of the living room and politely decline the offer. She took one step backward, turning her body away from the open door and the safety it promised. She didn't want the house. The indoors was a place for broken things, and she was no longer broken. Instead, she turned her attention entirely back to Henry. She hopped across the frosty porch boards until she was sitting right at the toe of his heavy leather work boot. She looked up at him, let out a short, urgent chitter, and flicked her tail. Henry frowned, confused. He slowly knelt on the porch, ignoring the sharp protest of his arthritic knees against the cold wood. He set his mug down on the deck. "What is it?" he whispered, offering his large, calloused hand, palm up, thinking perhaps she wanted another almond. She didn't want food. She placed her two tiny front paws onto his thick index finger, and then she did something that made Henriette's breath catch in his throat. She opened her mouth and very gently closed her teeth around the thick, hardened callus on the side of his finger. It was a bite. There was no pain, no breaking of the skin. It was an incredibly precise, calculated pressure, her sharp, tiny incisors holding him with the exact same delicate firmness a mother cat uses to carry her kittens. Henry froze, his eyes wide. He could feel the rapid, pulsing warmth of her mouth against the chilled skin of his hand. Before he could process the sheer trust of the gesture, she began to pull. She planted her back legs, one perfectly straight, one bearing the invisible memory of a coffee stirrer, and tugged his giant hand backward, aiming toward the porch steps. The contrast is from nowhere else. The contrast was utterly ridiculous. A 200-pound carpenter being physically led by a creature that weighed slightly more than a heavy grapefruit. Okay, Henry breathed, a soft, disbelieving laugh escaping his lips. "Mot met coming. Don't pull your teeth out on my account." He stood up, leaving his coffee steaming on the porch boards, and allowed himself to be led. He took a step down the wooden stairs, his boots thumping heavily. She released his finger, bounded down to the next step, looked back over her shoulder, and waited. When Henry hesitated, unsure of the protocol, she let out an incredibly impatient, raspy churr, as if scolding a very slow, very dense pupil. She hopped back up, grabbed the hem of his faded denim jeans in her teeth, and gave it a sharp yank. "All right, boss, lead the way." Henry chuckled, zipping his plaid jacket up to his chin. They moved into the yard. The frozen grass crunched loudly beneath Henry's boots while she flowed over the frost like silver water. She didn't lead him toward the towering, ancient oak tree which Henry had always assumed was her absolute domain. Instead, she navigated toward the far corner of the property, where a massive, untamed thicket of wild rose bushes and dense blackberry brambles grew in a tangled, chaotic mound against the old split-rail fence. As they walked, A profound, quiet reflection washed over Henry, altering the very gravity of his world. A year ago, he had carried her out of the cold and into his home. He had been the steward, the giant who dictated the boundaries of her world, keeping her safe behind heavy doors and storm windows. He had invited her into his quiet life. But as he followed the tiny, bobbing gray tail through the biting November wind, he realized that the dynamic had entirely shifted. She wasn't his guest anymore. She was inviting him into her world. She was the guide, and he was the clumsy, lumbering visitor in a vast, untamed kingdom. He didn't know what she wanted to show him, but as they approached the dense, thorny wall of the dormant rose bush, Henry felt a strange, thrilling sense of honor. He had spent his entire life building houses to keep the chaotic, unpredictable wild at bay. Now, he was being gently, stubbornly dragged right into the heart of it by a creature who had decided that, despite his size and his clumsy ways, he belonged there with her. The wild rose bush was a formidable fortress, a dense, chaotic tangle of thorny, arched canes that had grown unchecked for a decade against the rotting split rail fence. In the summer, it was a riot of pale pink blooms and buzzing bees, but now stripped bare by the November frost, it looked like a massive, forbidding knot of barbed wire. It was the kind of thicket that effortlessly repelled hungry coyotes, curious foxes, and neighborhood dogs. It was certainly no place for a man with arthritic knees and a bulky plaid winter jacket. She didn't stop at the edge. The silver-gray squirrel slipped effortlessly through a tiny, invisible gap near the base of the brambles, her plumed tail vanishing into the shadows of the dry, dead leaves. Henry stood towering over the bush, the freezing wind biting at his ears. He looked down at the impenetrable wall of thorns, then down at his own massive, heavy boots. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, his breath pluming in the cold air. From deep inside the thicket, a sharp, incredibly demanding chitter echoed out. It was Tia warning. It was a summons. Henry let out a heavy sigh, resigning himself entirely to the absurdity of the moment. Slowly, agonizingly, he lowered his 200-pound frame to the frozen ground. His knees let out a sharp chorus of pops, protesting the cold, hard earth. The damp chill of the frost instantly began to seep through the worn denim of his jeans, but he didn't stop. He lay on his stomach, resting his weight on his forearms, and pressed his face close to the freezing mud to peer under the lowest branches. The air down there held a vastly different sensory profile. Escaping the biting wind, the underbrush smelled intensely of raw, dark earth, decaying cedar needles, and the deep, silent hibernation of the woods. A single, sharp thorn grabbed the shoulder of his jacket, tearing a small, satisfying hole in the plaid fabric, but Henry barely noticed. He army crawled a few inches deeper, ignoring the dirt, smudging his weathered cheeks. About 3 feet into the heart of the thicket, safe from the wind and shielded from the sky by a dense canopy of interlocking thorns, lay a hollowed-out depression beside an old, rotting stump. And there she was. She was waiting for him, perched on the edge of a large, meticulously constructed spherical nest. It was a masterpiece of woodland engineering, far more robust and weather-tight than the flimsy summer nests built high in the leafy canopies. She looked at Henry as large, dirt-streaked face poking through the brambles. In a wonderfully quirky display of hostessing, she didn't seem alarmed by his massive, clumsy intrusion into her sanctuary. Instead, she leaned forward and gave his nose a rapid, frantic pat-pat-pat with her front paws, as if dusting him off before he was allowed to see the exhibit. Satisfied, she turned her attention to the nest. Using her tiny, precise claws, she began to carefully pull back the top layer of woven dry oak leaves and pine needles that served as the roof. Henry held his breath, his chest tight against the cold ground. As the roof parted, a faint, impossibly tiny sound reached his ears, a high-pitched, fragile mewling, like the squeak of a wet thumb against glass. Inside the deep, insulated bowl of the nest, a pile of tiny bodies shifted. There were 3 of them. They were incredibly small, barely the size of Henry's heavy thumb, their eyes still tightly closed against the world. They weren't tea-pink newborns anymore, but had just begun to sprout a very fine, incredibly soft layer of silver-gray fuzz. They wiggled blindly, seeking the warmth of their mother, their tiny, perfect paws waving in the chilly air. Henry's heart swelled so fast it physically ached against his ribs. He was looking at the impossible continuation of a life he had once held broken in his hands. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the thorns, he noticed something else, a detail that caused a hot, unexpected tear to break loose and carve a clean track down his dirt-smudged face. The inside of the nest, the softest, deepest layer cradling the fragile babies, was tea-lined with moss or downy thistle. It was woven kepite hot, long, brightly colored threads. There was the familiar, worsted gray wool of his stolen left socks, carefully unraveled and fluffed into a thick thermal barrier, but woven securely throughout it all, glowing like a soft beacon in the dark earth, were large, unmistakable shreds of buttery yellow flannel. Before she had answered the call of the wild, before she had run across the porch and up the great oak tree, she had returned to her makeshift home under his oak dresser. She had abandoned the yellow washcloth that had been her fortress and her safety during those long, terrifying months of healing. She had meticulously shredded it, carrying it out into the sprawling woods, piece by piece. She had taken the sanctuary Henry had provided and used it to build the very foundation of her own family. Henry lay in the freezing mud, unable to speak, unable to move. The cold no longer registered. A profound, shattering reflection settled into the very core of his soul. He had spent the last year believing he was merely a way station, a temporary, forgotten stop in the life of a wild creature. He had accepted the heartbreak of her absence as the cost of setting her free. But the wild, he realized, does say thank you with words, and it doesn't forget the hands that heal it. She had brought him here, dragging his massive, clumsy frame through the mud and the thorns, to show him that his love hadn't just saved one life. It had multiplied, and yet it comes from nowhere else. The warmth he had carefully fostered in his quiet, empty house was right here, shielding 3 tiny, beating hearts from the bitter November winter. She hopped gently down into the center of the nest, carefully arranging her thick silver tail over the babies to block the chill. She looked up at Henry, her dark eyes calm and absolute, and let out a soft, rhythmic, rattling purr. A sound she had learned on a braided wool rug pressed against an orange cat. And yet it comes from nowhere else. Henry rested his heavy, calloused cheek against the cold leaves, weeping silently, overwhelmed by the breathtaking honor of being completely, undeniably trusted by the wild. Henry didn't stay under the rose bush long. He knew his massive presence, no matter how trusted, was a disruption to the fragile thermal equilibrium of the nest, and the freezing November air was actively seeking a way through the thorns. With agonizing slowness, he backed his 200-pound frame out of the thicket, inch by inch, ignoring the way the briars snagged and tore at his plaid jacket. His knees were numb when he finally stood up in freezing mud, and his face was streaked with dirt and tears. Yet, he felt lighter than he had in a decade. He walked back to the farmhouse, the frost crunching beneath his heavy boots, leaving his cooling coffee forgotten on the porch boards. The house, when he entered, felt entirely different. It was to the sanctuary of a solitary man anymore. It was the headquarters of a sprawling multi-species family. The winter routines that followed were vastly different from the quiet, contained healing of the previous year. The dynamic had completely flipped. Henry was no longer trying to bring the wild indoors. The wild was inviting him out. Every morning, regardless of the biting frost or the swirling snow, Henry would bundle himself in his torn plaid jacket and his heaviest wool socks, making sure to wear the rights and the lefts as the grand thefts had ceased, and walk out to the edge of the rosebush. He didn't intrude on the nest again. He simply sat on an old, overturned wooden milk crate just outside the thorny perimeter, his breath fogging the air, and offered a steady, quiet presence. He became the designated supplier. He brought raw almonds, black oil sunflower seeds, and whole walnuts, leaving them in a small, hollowed-out cedar bowl he had carved specifically for the task. The quirky dynamic of their interactions resumed in full force, and yet it comes from nowhere else. She would emerge from the thicket, her silver coat fluffed to double its size against the cold, and immediately begin bossing him around. If the bowl was empty when she arrived, she would hop onto the toe of his boot, glare up at his face, and let out that raspy, stalling lawnmower churr of profound indignation. Moat met moving, moat meter moving. Henry would chuckle, his frozen fingers fumbling in his pockets for the almonds. As the weeks turned into a deep, freezing January, the babies began to grow. The first time Henry saw them, they were just tiny, uncoordinated flashes of gray fuzz tumbling near the entrance of the thicket. By February, they were miniature replicas of their mother, chaotic and impossibly fast, turning the dormant rosebush into their own personal, thorny jungle gym. One bitterly cold afternoon, Henry was sitting on his milk crate, watching the three juveniles attempting to wrestle a single peanut away from each other. Their mother was sitting on the fence rail above them, meticulously grooming her tail. Suddenly, the boldest of the three, a tiny male with a distinctly darker strip of fur running down his back, stopped wrestling. He turned his attention to the giant, flannel-clad mountain sitting a few feet away, moving with the jerky, hesitant caution of the very young. He crept toward Henry. He stopped at the edge of Henry's heavy leather boot, his nose twitching furiously as he processed the strange scents of pine soap and wood smoke. Henry froze, terrified to even blink. He kept his hands flat on his knees. The tiny squirrel didn't run away. He placed his two front paws against the leather of Henry's boot, stood up as tall as he could, and gave the thick shoelaces a rapid, experimental pat, pat, pat. He then looked up, directly past Henry, toward his mother on the fence rail. She paused her grooming. She looked down at her baby, then looked at Henry. She didn't issue a warning chitter. She didn't flick her tail in alarm. She simply let out a soft, low purr and went back to washing her face. Given the ultimate stamp of maternal approval, the tiny squirrel launched himself. He scrambled up the leg of Henry's denim jeans, his tiny claws pricking through the thick fabric. He navigated the vast expanse of Henry's lap, finally settling in the crease of his folded arms. He found the torn hole in the plaid jacket, the one his mother's rosebush had caused months ago, shoved his head inside the fabric, and promptly fell asleep, a tiny, vibrating ball of warmth against Henry's chest. Henry sat perfectly still, in the freezing air, tears welling up in his eyes once more. A profound, overwhelming reflection washed through him, rewriting the entire narrative of his life. For years, he had believed that grief was a permanent, isolating condition, that a house once emptied of love could never truly be filled again. He had built walls and kept to himself, terrified that loving something would only end in loss. But as he felt the tiny heartbeat vibrating against his chest and watched the silver mother on the fence rails, trusting him completely with her most precious creation, he realized the magnificent truth. Love was a finite resource that vanished when a life ended, or when a door opened. Or love was an ecosystem. When you poured it out, even into something as small and broken as a fallen squirrel, it didn't disappear. It soaked into the earth. It grew, and eventually it multiplied, coming back to you in forms you could never have imagined. The wild had taken his quiet, broken heart, woven it with yellow flannel, and given it back to him, whole and thriving. Spring returned to the farmhouse, not with the hesitant, melting drip of the previous year, but with a vibrant, chaotic explosion of life. The great oak tree traded its skeletal winter branches for a sprawling, dense canopy of electric green, and the wild rose bush by the split-rail fence erupted into a magnificent wall of fragrant, pale pink blooms. Inside the house, the heavy, muffled silence of Henry's solitary years had been permanently, wonderfully banished. The grandfather clock still ticked in the hallway, but it was now merely the baseline rhythm for a symphony of chattering, scratching, and the constant, lively thumping of small paws. Small paws. Henry had stopped trying to keep the outdoors out. The heavy wooden front door spent most of May propped wide open, the screen door unlatched to allow for the free flow of traffic. The farmhouse had become a porous border between the human world and the wild. An open sanctuary for the silver-gray mother and her three rapidly growing juveniles. The quirky, hyper-specific behaviors of the mother had thoroughly imprinted on her offspring, resulting in a hilariously chaotic daily routine. The babies had discovered Henry's laundry, but their mother's architectural genius. They simply treated his clothing as a game, and yet it comes from nowhere else. Henry would frequently find a single, heavy-worsted wool sock draped dramatically over the lampshade, or discover 3 pine cones meticulously tucked into the toe of his leather work boots. Once, he reached for his chipped enamel mug on the kitchen counter, only to find a perfectly intact, slightly damp acorn resting proudly at the bottom. Barnaby, the large orange tabby, had aged another year, his movements growing slower and his size growing heavier. Yet, he had remarkably accepted his fate as the patriarch of a multi-squirrel flock. The babies, possessing zero concept of the ancient predator-prey dynamic, viewed the massive cat purely as premium, heated real estate. It was a common sight to find Barnaby sprawled flat on his side in a pool of golden afternoon sunlight on the braided wool rug, completely covered in sleeping juvenile squirrels. If one of them shifted too much, Barnaby wouldn't even open his pale green eyes. He would simply let out a long, wheezing groan of profound suffering until the tiny offender settled back down into his orange fur. One warm, breezy afternoon, Henry found himself on the front porch, his toolbox open beside him. He was finally repairing the bottom wooden step, the one that had groaned under his weight for a decade. As he measured the fresh pine board, his arthritic hands moving a steady, practiced grace, the silver-gray mother descended from the oak tree. She bounded across the yard, hopped onto the porch railing, and let out her familiar, raspy chirp, instantly demanding her mid-afternoon almond. Henry smiled, reaching into his flannel pocket and offering the nut flat on his calloused palm. She took it gently, sitting back on her haunches, her thick, plumed tail sweeping the wood. As he watched her eat, Henry deliberately adjusted his measurements for the new porch step. Instead of cutting the board flush to the riser, he intentionally left a small 2-inch gap at the far corner, a tiny one to seek for anyone's, small and gray, who might want to seek shelter under the floorboards when the summer storms rolled in. He secured the board, driving the screws home with a quiet satisfaction, and sat back on its heels. The air was rich with the sweet, intoxicating scent of blooming roses and the deep, earthy aroma of his own aged cedar shingles. He picked up his chipped enamel mug from the railing, the coffee long gone cold, and looked out over his sprawling, imperfect, beautifully chaotic yard. A profound, quiet reflection settled completely into his bones, absolute and peaceful. For so many years, he had operated under the belief that an empty house was a safe house. He had believed that his capacity to love had been used up, cleanly severed by grief, and that the only way to protect his heart was to stop using it. He had built his life like a fortress, sealing every crack against the draft. But the universe, in its infinite poetic wisdom, had thrown a tiny, broken, uninvited guest from the highest branch of an oak tree directly into his path. She had dragged a wooden coffee stirrer across his wool rug, stolen his left socks, shredded his yellow washcloth, and completely dismantled his carefully constructed loneliness. She had taught him that a heart is teat, a fragile glass jar meant to be kept empty and safe on a shelf. It is a muscle. It is a wild, resilient thing that only grows stronger when it is broken open and asked to hold the weight of another living creature. Henry took a deep breath of the spring air, closing his eyes as a soft breeze rustled the oak leaves. His life was messy now. It was full of muddy paw prints, stolen laundry, and the constant, lingering anxiety of loving things that lived outside in the unpredictable wild. But as he listened to the rattling purr of the old cat inside the screen door and felt the tiny, rapid pat, pat, pat of a juvenile squirrel investigating the laces of his boot, Henry knew he wouldn't trade a single second of the chaos. The house was finally truly alive, and the giant was no longer sleeping alone. The fire in the cast iron stove has long since burned down to a soft, pulsing orange glow, casting long, gentle shadows across the braided wool rug. We pull the camera back now, out through the open door, past the ancient oak tree, and into the quiet canopy of the spruce woods. The world outside is peaceful, wrapped in the cool, soothing embrace of the spring night. The wind chimes on the porch sway ever so slightly, offering a soft, tinny lullaby to the darkness, a gentle reminder that the house is breathing, waiting, and welcoming. For those of you listening, wrapped in your own soft blankets, holding your own quiet reflections, know that the love we give to the fragile things in this world never truly vanishes. It climbs the highest branches, and it weaves itself into the very fabric of the wild. You do not have to be perfect to be a sanctuary. You only have to be willing to leave the door open just a crack. Because some wild hearts, once they learn your hands are safe, and once they know the warmth of your quiet devotion, never truly leave. And yet it comes from nowhere else. They stay in the rustle of the leaves, the scratching at the door, and the beating of our own mended chests. Thank you for sharing this quiet time with me, for sitting by this fire and letting the world slow down. May your own heart find its sanctuary, and may your home always have room for a little bit of beautiful chaos. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.
Behind the news you've just watched is the hard work of an entire editorial team. We don't just aggregate, we independently verify facts, rebuild the narrative structure, and combine it with visual and audio effects to deliver information in the most engaging and honest way possible. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll return with more high-quality stories soon.